Okay, and I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Okay, so luckily you guys have been connecting here through Teams to the 32SIB class. On Tuesday, I did record the class, and the recording is linked right there on my main page. I'll put a link as well at the end of the week on our 32SIB page as well. But if you missed the discussion I had and the presentation I gave on intuition, you can find that on that recording there, if that is something that you'd need useful come next week when you guys are back to class. Here again is the schedule we had set up, and I'll just shift this over here to today. So as we had originally planned, we're going to be talking today about memory and imagination, and if we have time, faith, all those things. And then we can also talk more about those next week. Okay. And then it's back on to working on your final course assessments. And we'll take some time next week to sort of, I'll take some time to explain those as well. Just gonna pause here for a sec, close that. Okay, so all that's there. Plus, if there's anything from previous units you guys still want to complete, and some of you, by the way, have been doing that, which is awesome, and I've been updating marks on that. We can do that, and then that gives us those weeks left. And you can see here, if I just sort of point this out, counting Monday, there will be 5 classes yet left. 3 classes next week for you guys, 2 the week after, and then 1 more class right on the end of January on the 31st. So 5 more classes plus the last class is what's left in this course. Okay, so that in that time frame, you want to complete those 2 final assessments. We're going to go over the details of them in class, and any other things that you need to complete from previously in the course. It shouldn't be too much of a time crunch. Hopefully you can do most of that in class. I mean, maybe something like your essay, you might have to spend a little bit of time outside of class doing, but there should be enough class time left to complete that fairly easily for you guys. And I know you're going to have lots of stuff at the end of the semester in other courses, so that's why I wanted that time so you can spend the time in class working on that stuff for my class. Yesterday, I had a Teams meeting with the 42SIB class, and they're obviously doing the same thing. They're getting their stuff ready for the end of the semester, but their stuff is being sent off into the IB, right? So theirs is the final assessment, the internal assessment for their IB course. TOK is the only IB course that is completed in semester 1 of your grade 12 year. And again, I don't know what you're taking in IB. Maybe you're just taking theory of knowledge. Maybe you're taking IB English or IB chemistry or IB this or IB that. Maybe you're doing a full diploma. But when you go into your grade 12 year in IB, the only course that is fully completed by the end of the first semester is theory of knowledge. And theory of knowledge doesn't have an exam either. It's only based on those assessments, the essay and the presentation. So obviously it's a little more important for them to get everything all lined up properly. So next week I'll share some of the resources that they've been compiling to help complete these final assessments. I realize you guys don't have to do as big a job as them because we're just doing essentially a practice run this year. But I asked them yesterday, what advice would you want me to share with today's 32SIB class, you guys, for if you're going to take theory of knowledge next year? Like, what advice would you give? And you know, there's a variety of different answers, but they said things like, you know, really try on that essay to, you know, don't just hit the minimum word count, but try to go a little bit beyond so that when you're in grade 12, you kind of have a more realistic feeling of how the essay would go. The other thing, though, the exhibition is brand new to them this year, just like it's brand new to you guys and brand new to me. It's something that's changed over the last 15 years of teaching IB. So this is the first year for that new assessment. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot to give there, but what I do have and what they did say they would share with me is they said that they would be I didn't actually get confirmation from all of them, but they did say to me, some of them, that they'd be willing to share what they do on that assessment so that you guys have it as an example to look at for next year. So that would be something that they can share with you moving forward. Again, I haven't got confirmation from all of them, but that's the case. Okay, so that's my spiel to start the class. It's 9:08. What I want to do with the remainder of the period today is to give a presentation like I did on Tuesday, starting with memory, and then if there's time, moving into imagination, and then if there's time after that, moving into faith. Okay, whatever I don't have time to cover, I'll cover when we get back next week in terms of presentation. And I think that'll be even better because that might be a little more interactive. Obviously, we can't do any activities on these. So it's just essentially me giving my presentation of the content. That all being said, you are absolutely welcome to contribute to the discussion and pipe in anytime you'd like, either through the microphone or you can always email me afterwards. And I don't know if the chat's working today. It was working in some classes yesterday that students were able to chat. So I don't know if that's the case or not, but those are definitely options for you guys. And if you want to review this later because you realize what I'm going to talk about might affect your final assessments in a more major way, then as I said, I'm recording this. You can always go back and watch the recording. Oh, and that reminds me, next week, as I mentioned on Tuesday, on Monday, we're going to sit down and look at if there's anything left in this course that you need me to cover in more detail or give you resources for as you start moving towards your final assessments. Now, you may not have those answers right away, but all of that kind of needs to get taken care of next week, because at that point, then there'll just be a few classes left to get those final assessments all wrapped up. Okay, so for example, if I don't get to faith as a presentation today, and then you realize next week that you're actually going to write about faith in your essay, then maybe it might be useful to you to have a few more resources on that. Maybe you do want to watch a discussion on faith, or maybe you do want to have an activity that's involved with faith that you could kind of do. So those are things we can talk about next week. If there's anything from this course missing that you think is going to get covered in your essay or your exhibition. It's obviously a little different than a course like chemistry, where there's an exam and Mr. Dearland couldn't just leave out a unit. And then you're like, well, I don't know if that's going to get covered on my exam. You know, it will be covered on your exam. But in TOK, you have a little more control. So if faith is not something you're going to write about in your essay, then maybe it's not important to you that you need to cover that as a way of knowing. Okay, take a sip of coffee. Does anyone have any questions before I push forward? All right, let me share my screen. And let's start talking about memory. So what do we mean by memory as a way of knowing? How do we know things through memory? Well, that's obviously what I want to talk about through this presentation today. I mean, to say I know it because I feel it, and I know it because I see it, I know it because I heard it, right? Those are the ways of knowing, the traditional ones, the sense perception, the language, the emotion, the reason ones. But is memory really a way of knowing things? Okay. Through our memories is the knowledge, including skills like the memory of how to play the piano, the memory of how to ride a bike, the memories of our past experiences, our courses we've taken, the books we've read, the shows we've watched, etc. Okay? Even knowledge we're currently gaining is getting added to our memory. Okay? Our memory is a lot of times what gives us a personal sense of identity. We know who we are through our memory, and our place in the community that we remember is our place is through our memory. Okay, so there's no doubt that our memory is significant to us as human beings. It gives us a significant place in our sort of place in the world and a significant part of how we understand the world. But I think the first question we should ask is, how reliable are our memories? There's been a lot of research done on this, right? So what is it to be quote unquote you? A very philosophical question. What do our memories give us about that, right? So maybe you have a very vivid memory about something about yourself, maybe a birthday party or your first kiss or a traumatic event like a family member passing away or something like that. And you attach it to those ways of knowing that we already have, like sense perception. I saw it. I remember. I was there, right? Those are memory-based sort of knowledge statements. And they also affect who you are right now, right? Like if you had a traumatic event that you remember from your past, it might have a very strong effect on who you are now. But we can't remember everything. We're not computer hard drives. We're not like videotapes where we can rewind it back and play things. We're not a YouTube video where we can scroll the little bar at the bottom, right? We're not photographs. Our memory is a little more complex than that. So here's some questions to think about. What is the earliest memory that you think you can draw up in your brain? Can you draw up memories of your first birthday? Can you draw up memories of your birth? Can you draw up memories of you prenatal, like before birth? Is that memory actually accurate? Or is it a reconstruction, right? Is there parts of your life that you have no memory of, right? Like there's this sort of blank zone where I know there was something going on at that time, but I have no memory, okay? What in your memory qualifies as something that you're going to remember for a long time or a short time? Is it only the good memories you remember? Is it only the bad memories that you remember? Is it only strong memories? What makes them strong memories? Well, I don't have answers to those questions. They're just really strong questions to philosophically ponder, right? So to understand this nature of memory, let's put it into our sort of philosophical TOK sort of concepts, right? So if we look at, say, justified true belief, not all memories are treated the same way by our brains, right? So for example, knowledge of skills, how to ride a bike. Our knowledge of that skill isn't necessarily tied to a specific memory event, right? Maybe we don't remember the day we learned to ride a bike. We just remember the skills, right? So psychologists call those procedural memories, right? We remember the procedure of doing it, okay? This memory is often encoded into our brain and we can kind of recall it without having to draw out a specific event, right? Maybe that is connected to what we talked about on Tuesday. Maybe that's connected to something like intuition, okay? Next philosophical question to ponder. If your memories of the past were somehow deleted, like you can delete files off a computer, if you could delete a memory and just lose it, what else do you think you would lose? Right? Like if you lost the memory of the first time you rode a bike, would you forget how to ride a bike? If you lost the memory of a traumatic event that occurred in your past, like a family member passing away, would that change who you are? Would something else get changed, right? To show that that connection between memory and your sort of being, your sense of self, how important is that? Again, not a question to have an answer to, but a question to ponder. So what about facts and events? How are those remembered in our brain, right? Like a specific sort of memory of let's say the last time you guys were in TOK class. How do you process that memory? Well, that's something called declarative memory. It uses also something called semantic memory and episodic memory. And again, I'm not a psychologist, but there's different sort of ways they've categorized memory to put them into groups and then subgroups, like memory based on information, memory based on experience and time and place. We can put them into these little categories like folders on a computer, right? So this is going to be my declarative memory. This is going to be my procedural memory. This is my semantic. This is my episodic, okay? But if someone makes a statement to you that says, I know that Jack took my lunch that day because I remember it. How are we to question that, right? Just like we question everything else of someone, we could say, well, how do you know you remember that, right? And that's a tricky question to answer, right? When you say to someone, well, how do you know you remember? You're like, well, I just remember it. And then you could, like you would say to someone, well, how do you know the sky is blue? You could ask them to prove or to justify that memory claim, right? So how do we justify memory claims? Okay. Let's take a sip of coffee. Let's keep going. Okay, so a lot of memory, when put into a legal environment, let's say it's a murder trial, is based on often eyewitness testimony, right? So, you know, Your Honor, I saw the defendant kill this man, right? So the testimony in eyewitness trials has a lot of sort of persuasive elements to it, okay? Is it true? Is it not true? Right? Should the lawyers question this person who says they saw this thing? Okay? Because when they say they saw it, they're also tapping into memory. Okay? So one example of this is in New Jersey's Supreme Court. They realized that memory was such an important part of their legal system that they did an extensive study on the reliability of the memory of eyewitnesses in trials. The results that were published in August of 2011 said that memory is not a reliable record of the past. It does not work like a video where you can just scroll back the little circle on a YouTube video and rewatch something. That memory is not like that. That human memory they described as a constructive, dynamic, and selective process. Now, if we look at those three words, especially the first word, to think that memories are constructed, okay, means you're building your memories. Like right now, your memory of this event 2 hours from now, when it's 2 hours from now and say someone says to you, what was your remote learning TOK class like today? You might actually construct a memory of it. You go, oh my God, it was so boring. Wax had this weird background. You know, he thinks he's cool, putting his little Marvel background. He's wearing his little jet shirt and stuff like that. You might construct those pieces of it, but maybe you construct something different. They say, well, what was this weird background? Say, oh, he had Iron Man in the background, some sort of weird Iron Man thing. Now, as you look at me now, that's not true, but you could construct that memory in the future based on maybe a slight mistake in how you are remembering it. When I say it's dynamic, your memories are changing. So maybe even the suggestion of me saying Iron Man might affect your memory in the future, okay? And also your memories are selective, okay? What you choose to remember about certain events is just like a sense perception thing, what we choose to select and not select in that particular memory, okay? And so this study gave lots of examples of this. In one example, they cited the case of Elizabeth Loftus, who said there were 3 stages of memory. The acquisition of memory. So right now you guys are acquiring a memory of this event. 2, the retention. So now, will the thing that you're acquiring right now actually get retained? So that's like, you know, as you're looking through pictures in Google, are you actually going to save any of these pictures? Or are you just going to go right past them? But then the third part is later on, you obviously had something in your memory, you retrieve it from your memory. At each of these 3 stages, you could make a mistake, is what they said in the legal trial system. The judge said that at each of these stages, the information ultimately offered as memory can be distorted, contaminated, and even falsely imagined. The witness does not perceive all that a videotape would disclose, but rather gets the gist of things and constructs a memory on bits of information in what seems plausible. The witness does not encode all the information that a videotape does. Memory rapidly and continuously decays. Retained memory can be unknowingly contaminated by post-event information. And the witness's retrieval of stored memory can be impaired and distorted by a variety of factors, including suggestive interviewing and identification procedures conducted by law enforcement personnel. This was put forward in a study done on the legal system in New Jersey. And obviously it shows that even though we rely on memory in the legal system and we rely on memory as part of our knowledge system, it isn't perfect, okay? They also said there was lots of things that could cause errors. So for example, witnesses were asked to pick out several people from a lineup that had committed a crime, right? And they realized that the nature of the instructions they give the witnesses, the amount of time between the observation and when they identified the people in the lineup, the way they constructed the lineup, how they put the different people in the lineup, and the administration of the identification. So the administrator also had no idea. In other words, the person who was asking the person to identify also didn't know who the supposed criminal was. All of those parts of the study affected the results, okay? So it was really easy to just change one or two variables and you would see different results in the way memory would be tested. So as a result, New Jersey said, you know what? We're not going to rely on eyewitnesses to the same extent we do now. So their entire legal system changed on that. And that's important, right? It's important to think how important memory is as part of our knowledge system. I mean, that was a lot of legal stuff I just mentioned, but what about, like, for example, I mentioned you guys earlier in the period, can you remember your first birthday party? What facts, like, for example, do you remember one of your presents? Do you remember what kind of cake you had? Do you remember who was there, right? Are those memories accurate, or are you reconstructing it? Is what you're remembering about your first birthday party kind of the same as what you remember about your second birthday party? Are they what's called an amalgam, where you're putting the memories together and constructing them? Okay, so let's talk about its connection to what we talked about on Tuesday, intuition. So we know memory decays over time, and we often rely on it to just pop ideas into our mind. But that's also how we described intuition on Tuesday. Intuition was that sort of aha moment when something pops into your mind. So one common error we make is something called hindsight bias, right? The so-called I knew it all along fallacy, okay? It means that we kind of look back on something and go, well, yeah, of course I knew, right? Related to this is consistency bias, where we interpret the past in a way that's consistent on how we are now, right? That we think we are, we were more mature in the past because we're more mature now. But that's a bit of a bias, right? We're kind of basing that memory on the way we are now, right? We tend to retrieve our memories in an anecdotal way, right? So we kind of think about it like it was, oh yeah, I remember that time that guy was doing that thing, right? We construct this anecdote of how kind of it went. And this again is subject to lots of different potential probability problems there. Okay, so how likely is it for something to have happened based on our example that we can draw from memory, okay? Some memories are obviously more important, some are more representative, and some are more likely, right? Like if we remember a superhero flying over, that's not very likely that that occurred. Some are more important because it involves important aspects of our lives or our personalities. And some are more representative, like this memory is specifically connected to what I'm trying to remember. So there's something in psychology called the primacy recency effect, also known as the serial position effect, which basically is that we tend to recall the first and last items. They do these tests all the time. They'll show people like 20 cards from a deck of cards, like Jack of clubs, Ace of spades, 2 of diamonds, 3 of clubs, 7 of diamonds, 9 of diamonds, 3 of spades. And then they'll say, tell me the cards. Tell me what you remembered. And you know which ones they tend to remember the most? The very first card that they were listed. Actually, how many of you remember that it was, which card it was? And the last card that I mentioned. The primacy recency effect, that we tend to recall series in terms of stuff that happened first and last, okay? Now, as well, we can talk about the probability of an event. Probability can be calculated mathematically, okay? So if I said to you, well, how likely is it that you remember that event? You have to think about all the possible events and then the one that was favorable to you, okay? The one that you say you're recalling. And that would give you a probability. Well, in the real world, that's very difficult to calculate because the number of possible events is almost infinite, right? So, and we're drawing those events from our memory. So both the numerator and the denominator of this probability calculation is all based on probable problems that could occur with our memory. Okay, so that memory expert Elizabeth Loftus said that we have developed a mechanism in our brains to delete memories so that we can live and function without being haunted by the past. So that we intentionally, in order to cope with certain, especially traumatic memories, intentionally delete them. And we allow them to sort of clear out of the way so we can make room for new memories. So this is, again, like if you look at your backpack. Every morning when you get ready for school, there might be stuff in your backpack that makes it too full. So you have to take some out to make space for the new stuff that's coming in that day. So forgetting things in memory is a mechanism that human beings do to not only deal with traumatic events, but also weed out memories that we don't need anymore and make room for new memories that we might need that could not only affect us more positively, but could be something more useful to us. Okay? So here's an interesting way to look at it by sort of flipping the script. Instead of saying it's my failure to remember something, we also have this ability to fail to forget things. This is something that psychologists and psychiatrists deal with when people are dealing with traumatic events. They say, well, can't you just forget about this event? And the answer might be no. People can't forget. And that might be a bit of a failure, that maybe by actually deleting that traumatic memory might be more beneficial to you. Okay? So here's the philosophical question. If you could control your memory, like the way you do the hard drive on your computer, and you could delete memories and save memories, what memories would you ultimately delete so that they're gone forever? And how much thought would you go into doing that? The answer could be none. I don't want to delete any of my memories, even the bad ones. That's again, something that you could philosophically ponder as part of this. All right. So how is memory in terms of suggestibility? How much can we alter someone's memory? How much can we change it? So if we agree that memory is a constructed thing in addition to a recalled thing, okay? Loftus said that research around child abuse from the 1990s said that a lot of victims had repressed traumatic memories of abuse and that those memories needed to be recovered. Now, she wasn't doing the research, but she found that was happening in the 1990s, that they were trying to recover a lot of traumatic memories from children of abuse. And what she did when she looked into these recovered memories, she found how easily they could have been influenced by the people trying to help the people, the children. That by implanting certain suggestions, and this wasn't done maliciously, it was just done with good intentions, that they actually might contribute to constructing false memory. Okay. So in 1998, the Royal College of Psychologists stated no evidence exists for the repression and recovery of verified severely traumatic events, and that their role in the symptom formation has yet to be proved. So this has shown that memory is much more suggestible than previously thought. So maybe I can influence your memory about your first birthday party right now by putting certain memories in your brain, and they could stay in there for a long time, if not forever. That memory is highly suggestible, okay? So another example, and I was teaching this morning, the morning of this event, so I have strong memories of it. September 11th, 2001, the attacks on the American World Trade Centers in New York City, okay? They looked at Americans who were there that day and said that they had memory like a flashbulb going off, that really, it was a powerful memory that had emotional impact on them. 1 year later, they studied 3,000 Americans, and only 60% of them were correct about the details of that day, which is a pretty good number, that 60% of people remembered the events accurately. 3 years after that, it dropped to 50%. Okay, so it shows that over time, not only does memory decay, but that memory can be influenced. Because obviously, since the events of September 11th, there's been a lot of media coverage, there's been a lot of examination of that historical event. And as a result, maybe people's memories got affected by things from their current on their memories of the past. I'm going to sneeze, so just one sec. Excuse me. All right. So there are all these factors affecting memory, right? Direct experience, the emotional impact, how close we are physically to the event, primacy, recency effect. All of these affect the accuracy of our memory recall. So memory doesn't just operate on its own, okay? It interacts with our other ways of knowing, like sense perception, reason, emotion, language, etc., even intuition. And as well, I'm going to make the case that it's going to also interact with the ones that we haven't covered yet, imagination and faith, okay? So as that New Jersey case stated, okay, our memory is a constructive, dynamic, and selective process. Pausing for a second. That's my presentation on memory as a way of knowing. So what I'd like to do now is I think I'd like to dive into imagination. It's actually one of my shorter presentations, probably the shortest one. So I think I'd like to do that one and just sort of see if we can get through it. And if not, I mean, because there is still about, 15 minutes left in the class. And if not, then we can look at this next week, okay? And then faith, I think I'll leave for Monday to talk about. And that way we can maybe do an activity or something around that as well. Anyone have any comments before we go forward? Are you guys all even there? Bet you some of you aren't there right now. But some of you put your cameras on and have gone back to sleep. Oh well. Let's get back to it. Let's talk about imagination. Here's a good quote from Einstein. The true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination. So Einstein thinks imagination is very important to being called intelligent, okay? Before we go any further, I like that point. I mean, if you think about it, you might all know somebody who knows lots of facts, right? Or does really well on multiple choice tests because they can recall a bunch of information. But does that mean their imagination is strong, right? We also know people who have a really good imagination. They can create things that we've never seen before. Which of those two people would you say is highly intelligent? Okay. I know that they're going to each have elements of the other, but which do you value more in terms of intelligence? For Einstein, it was imagination. But let's define imagination. What is this word? Is it the power of the mind to create things that don't exist yet? Or find ways to put together things that exist in a way that we've never thought of before, okay? So our imagination allows us to, for example, when we read a book, imagine that we're in that scenario, right? So when you read Huck Finn, you can imagine that you're back in time in that fictional world. When you're in history class and you're hearing about someone like Abraham Lincoln, you can imagine what he looks like and what that time was like. When you hear about something like the Himalayan mountains, even though you may never ever go there, you might be able to imagine what they're like, okay? Sometimes that imagination is helped by more descriptions. Sometimes that imagination is helped by video or images of that event. Sometimes imagination is helped by understanding more specific scientific elements of it, right? Like how it works, so to speak, okay? So imagination could be described as creative thoughts, right? Like thoughts that are creative. So when we're thinking creatively or imagining, okay, are we deluding ourselves? Are we using experiences that are not real, but they're delusions? And I said that kind of in a negative way, but I mean, we don't have to necessarily put a negative connotation on that. Are delusions, things that aren't real, useful to us? Okay. When we read literature, when we watch a movie, when we listen to a teacher talking about a historical event and it's drawing up imagination or creative thoughts, are we creating delusions? Okay. When we can be presented with experiences that aren't normal, like scientific fiction type stuff, science fiction stuff, that maybe is now a leap into the imaginary world that goes beyond the normal into that delusional or imaginary realm that we can still do. We can all watch an Avengers movie and imagine that that's taking place, but we don't necessarily connect it to something real, right? Whereas if we're hearing Mr. McGuire talk about like Stalin and Russia, we might be able to imagine those events and maybe make a connection to them at one time being real. So is imagination just something unreal, something real, something delusionary, something creative? Is it all of those things? Okay, so now let's connect it to TOK. Let's define it as a way of knowing. So there's no really good definition or concept to human imagination. The ability to picture ourselves or events or stories or images in a sort of realm of creative thought, okay? It is possibly connected to memory because we're recalling events. It's possibly connected to sense perception because we're relying on the way we've seen things, heard things, smelled things, tasted things in the past. And it's definitely also in some ways connected to, say, reason, because we have to put those things together in a reasonable place, right? We're imagining like a scene like, World War II and Hitler in a bunker. We have to kind of use our reasoning to imagine that Hitler, is in the bunker, not standing on top of the bunker, right? Because that isn't necessarily reasonable. Okay, now let's get a little more philosophical. Some concepts of imagination are described as metaphysical. So the metaphysical combination is something that, literally the word meta means beyond. So metaphysical means beyond the physical. We're going to talk more about this when we get into our discussion on faith, right? So in Hinduism, it's described as a transcendent power that through the gods create and sustain the harmony of the universe and through which human beings grasp this harmony. It's a really pretty way to describe imagination. Plato, the philosopher, described imagination as the metaphysical role allowing human beings to bring to mind something eternal, the eternal forms beyond the world of the senses. Those are a little more sort of out there definitions of imagination. Now, what about the psychological aspects of imagination rather than the metaphysical attributes? Is there a bridge between thought and emotion, between senses and ideas? Maybe imagination can transform our experience into new memories and new meanings, right? Maybe a lot of definitions of imagination are cultural. Maybe the Canadian North American definition of imagination is very different than, say, the South African definition of imagination, or the Japanese definition of imagination, or the definition of imagination from Russia 2,000 years ago, right? Well, let's put in a knowledge question here. Can imagination give us knowledge of ourselves and the world? Can we actually get knowledge from imagination? Okay, let's look at some negatives. Not everyone's concept of imagination is positive. Some people view imagination as delusional, fantasies, daydreaming, that imagination is slowing you down, that if you just sit there and be a daydreamer all day and just imagine you're going to go to university without actually filling out an application, you're wasting your time. So a lot of people put imagination in a negative light, okay? That you're making stuff up, that you're playing with your imaginary friend, that's a waste of time. You're essentially lying to yourself. We've all found ourselves kind of lost in our own imaginations, and we have to kind of snap ourselves out of it and go, okay, come on, let's get to work. You might be doing that right now, okay? So one thing we have to do with imagination is distinguish between fact and fiction. What about our imagination is good? When we're very young, like young children, The line between fact and fiction can be very blurry. You know, like little children can imagine Santa Claus is delivering presents, and for them that could be very, very real, and it could still be real for you, okay? But their ability to draw that difference between reality and the imaginary realm and getting snapped back into reality, like, oh, there isn't a monster in my closet, can be something that is harder as you are younger. As adults, in theory, that line should be more clear. We should be able to distinguish between the imaginary realm and the real world a lot more clearly. But we also know that there is this delusional state that a lot of people have, right? The medical condition of schizophrenia is essentially a definition of that it's an abnormal social behavior, being unable to distinguish between what is real and what is not real. In other words, we can't snap out of a delusion. So that word delusion, in a more common sense, is used in a medical way to challenge an imaginary knowledge claim. Okay? When you tell someone they're being delusional, we're using it as a challenge to their imaginary knowledge claim. Okay? So this is a justification claim, right? Justified true belief. They're saying justify what you believe to be true because I think it's a delusion. Okay? Now, if someone is still holding to that imaginary knowledge claim, right, they will maybe be held to that and ignore counterclaims, be biased of other things, and might have to rely on other ways of knowing to really kind of sort of reaffirm what they claim to know. What about the term overactive imagination? That's never really looked at as a positive thing. Okay, that again is some suggestion that someone is just overthinking something and they're being delusional and they're not thinking things through. So again, this is putting imagination in a negative light, that it's potentially dangerous, that if you don't get into reality, if you imagine you can fly and test that by jumping off a building, there's going to be real world consequences to that. And so then a lot of people say that philosophically, your view of reality must contort or conform with what is actually real. That our model of reality has to match what is in fact real. And that we need to screen through the potential of imaginary worlds so that we don't get lost in that delusion. Okay? However, let's get a little more positive. Just because something is possible doesn't mean it's real, but that doesn't mean that our imagination is useless for that. Okay? If we never enter that imaginary world, maybe we'll never allow it to become real. All right, so let's connect imagination to creativity in these last couple minutes here. If we disregard all imaginary experiences and just look at the world as a realist all the time, okay, then will we ever have creative thoughts? Wouldn't creative thoughts be the ability to go beyond what we know to be real and really kind of do something what you could call innovative, right? Another word you see on the slide here is the word transcendent, which essentially means to move beyond something, just like the word metaphysical means beyond. Something that's transcendent means we move beyond. And we don't have to talk about this in a religious context. You could say, well, right now I can only imagine I can jump so far in my physical abilities. Maybe you're a basketball player. I can only jump this high. I can never jump high enough to dunk this basketball. But if you can imagine you can do it, and you can transcend what you can physically do now in the real world, maybe that imagination will create a source of creativity, a source of inspiration to allow you to innovate yourself, to move beyond what is currently real to you. So English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge said, imagination dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. Okay? It might be the force that allows us to draw on our life experiences, recombine it in new ways, and take it beyond what we have now. A scientist, Peter Medawar, said, scientific theories began as imaginary constructions. They begin, if you like, as stories. And the purpose of the critical or rectifying episode in scientific reasoning is precisely to find out whether or not these stories are, in fact, stories about real life. Does imagination use sense, perception, language, emotion, reasoning as part of the process? I would argue it does. So what are those connections? What are the sequence? What are the causations between those other ways of knowing and imagination? Historian, so I've shown you an artist, a scientist, and a historian said, imagination must work in a creative friction with a given world. There are rules as well as freedoms. There are hard edges of reality that one must respect. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. We got very close to the end. I think I only had 3 more slides, but we're at 9:48. So I'm going to just take a minute now to stop the video. Okay.